Civilized Society.
We're covering the movie V for Vendetta. This is our second episode on this movie because, as you may well know, we are in the midst of some political turmoil in this lifetime of ours. And a movie like V for Vendetta is helpful for identifying the dynamics that occur in said political turmoil. And one of those dynamics is inevitably, undoubtedly, every damn time, fear. The use of fear and the harnessing of the panic of a population to push through overreaching, powerful measures to control people, to turn people's attention in a direction other than where it could be if they were looking to improve things. In V for Vendetta, the government uses fear. And one of the main dynamics that you see is the protagonist losing her fear and becoming an individual, in my opinion, kind of like a self-actualized individual, but also a threat to the stability of the regime. And both of those things are, of course, linked, becoming less fearful, but also becoming individuated and becoming a threat to tyrannical power as a result of those two things. Now, why don't you introduce us to the word of the podcast in your characteristic style?
The word of the podcast this episode is going to be...
Is this an auction house? The word
That's
of the
what I always
podcast, word of the podcast.
I say that, and then I usually turn and I kind of get breath. Vox Populi. That is an esoteric term, so you are correct in making fun of me. But I'm trying to bring knowledge to people, trying to give people a smattering of Latin, a smattering of Greek. You know, the university has moved online. Yeah. And I'm doing my small part to bring people a little bit of the classical knowledge. Vox Populi, 1540s, Latin, literally voice of the people. Now, the full maxim, first attested in medieval Latin, is Vox Populi, Vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God.
I love it. Love that shit.
I mean, can we not agree that after months of struggle and guerrilla warfare and turmoil, that the word of the podcast has at least gained, you know, some legitimacy?
Yeah, of course. It's in the podcast. Anything in this podcast is legitimate by nature of it being in the podcast. See, that's that mainstream media mindset. If it's in this podcast, it is correct and legitimate by way of being in the podcast. That's all you need to know. Check your sources. If it's not the Civilized Society, check them again. Now go on. Tell me about where did this term come from? Because it interests me for personal reasons, for political reasons.
Well, that's the only entry on etymonline.com. It's a very simple word of the podcast I want to use. It's just Latin. It means voice of the people, and you want to talk about
but this
populism.
Phrase, the voice of the people, voice of God, where does that come from?
Well, earlier on, the full phrase, maxim they call it, you know, was the voice of the people is the voice of God.
Well, because the thing is that this is really interesting because it
the short
has
form
this...
Vox Pop. I've never heard of that. Vox Pop, attested by 1964.
1960s.
I don't like that, Vox Pop.
Yeah, they fucked it up. It's because that term got picked up in the art scene at some point, you know.
Did it?
So they, you know, shredded it. Because what I'm hearing in this idea of the voice of the people, the voice of God, is this interesting idea that of the individual's divinity, but it seems reversed because it's like the divinity of the group. And that's not something we often speak here about, the divinity of the group. Usually I am berating groups and warning against them. But I make an exception for populist groups because otherwise, and this is something we spoke about on one of the Fight Club episodes, which is there is obviously a danger in populism. There's been a lot of revolutions that have occurred that were under the rhetoric, the philosophy of populism, that didn't have great outcomes and were in and of themselves not great scenes. But the thing is that populism is kind of like, in some ways, this necessary evil, it seems like to me. And so you see this in this movie, right? Like, the whole point of this movie is that there is power in the people, and that's that cliche political phrase, the power of the people. Well, it's real. And that's why in this film you see that the regime uses fear to weaken the people, and so that they rely on the government. And it's a specific line in the movie too, where once that regime starts to lose control, they specifically try to invoke fear in the people by using the media. They start showing all these disasters happening, wars happening, famine all over the world, and very North Korean kind of tactic there. This idea of that, like, oh, everything's terrible outside of here. And that fear was meant to remind, he says very specifically, this authoritarian leader in the movie, we're going to remind them why they need us. And that's a really interesting dynamic to see play out, because it really makes you think about the fear-mongering that's undeniable in our mainstream media, and whether it solely serves the purpose of being, the kind of clickbait, or if it, whether intentionally or inadvertently, serves the purpose of instilling insecurity into a population so that they're more willing and more desperate for security in any form it may come, including that presented by the government in terms of, oh, we're going to protect you, we're going to save you, we just need some of your rights. And to remind people, this movie begins with a lockdown. Not saying anything. I'm not implying anything. I'm just saying V for Vendetta starts with a city in lockdown. That's all.
Well, I think it starts in the middle of something, which, I didn't read the original comic book or whatever this was based on, but one of Alan Moore, who wrote the comic book, one of his criticisms at this time was, and he's always, and this is the reason why I don't agree with a lot of what Alan Moore thinks sometimes, but I respect him, because he hates all the movies that are made from his comic books, like a true artist. And so and also he's interested in John Dee, which is something I also am interested in. He's this kind of English eccentric figure that is something that has been around for a long time. So respect enough to that. But he said about this movie, the Americans didn't have the guts to set it in America. They're doing a satire based on things that are happening, but they put it over in the UK. So in this movie, I think there's this idea that, like you said, the media are saying, oh, look at dangerous America, everything's chaotic. Here we have order. And I think that part of that is that they're not allowed to leave the UK to see what it's actually like in America. Now, if we wanted to make a comparison, and again, these comparisons, we're having fun. We're not, strictly speaking, making comparisons. But as I mentioned in the first part, something I didn't know that much was that Canadians that are unvaccinated haven't been allowed to even leave the country. I'm not sure if they're allowed to move from region to region. I don't know. But so then one could suggest something, right? One could think, well, what if you had a poor, misinformed, unvaccinated Canadian that took a flight to Florida in the midst of the pandemic and saw the differences that could cause cognitive dissonance in that individual. I mean, it could cause could cause that even within someone who has been vaccinated in Canada and been allowed by the magisterial government to leave their zone and see how things differ in other places in the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what North Korea does, right? They teach that everybody, like all the other countries, are worse off. So, and I think I'm not I don't remember if that's what Cuba did or not. I don't know what my mom told me. I think they teach that they were, at least when my mom lived there, that they would teach that the US is like a degenerate place or whatever, like something like that, you know? I don't think they could even they couldn't keep up the facade of like, oh, it's worse over there. You know, it's a little bit of a hard sell. But yeah, so this is, there's a lot of tropes going on in this film that are worth comparing to our modern times. But the idea of fear making people easily controlled, fear keeping people subservient, is a big one. Because, like we've spoken about before on this podcast, anyone that pretends that there was not at least a moment that they were afraid of the pandemic is a fool. Okay, or like for somehow they escaped actual, you know, coverage of the thing, and maybe they were living blissfully like a sheep herder in the mountains. Okay, in that case,
Just shepherd.
Oh yeah, if you were a shepherd in the mountains and you were not aware of the pandemic, so you were not afraid, then bless your heart, you did it right. But otherwise, I think we all had moments of genuine fear. I literally had a panic attack thinking about the possibility of some of my family dying. I had to pull over on the side of the road. And this was like literally when the pandemic broke. Okay, so don't like give me shit. This was, no one knew what the fuck was going on. We had no idea how bad it was going to be. We had no idea what would come. And I don't have panic attacks. So that was a level of fear that was pretty profound for me. And when people are that afraid, the desire for relief and security becomes probably one of the top desires, along with, you know, sustenance and having a roof over your head. It becomes something about survival. And so it makes sense that you can use fear, particularly as a government, to make your population more dependent on you, more subservient to you, because they turn to you for that safety and that security. And that's a really scary thing when it's being done for purposes of manipulation. It makes me think about the press release from Biden about, you know, wishing the unvaccinated a winter of severe illness and death for them and their loved ones and the hospitals that they would soon overwhelm. I mean, what's up? What's up with that? You know, that's kind of some sketchy shit coming from our own government in that case. That's not realistic, and that's not even a helpful form of messaging. If you really want to get people vaccinated, you can just fucking say that. You don't have to wish them a severe winter of illness and death.
Can we though consider for a second? You're saying part of your point is, I think, right, that fear is useful and it does work. You can use it to control people. Mm-hmm. And so you can then understand if there's a person in power who thinks that they're doing the right thing, right? Let's go beyond, and we can go into conspiracy theories. I'm not above it. But let's, for one moment, look at it this way. People in power, and we don't even have to use specific people, Fauci or Biden or whoever it is, or Trump before that. If they think is right, we talk about this a lot, if they think what they're doing is correct, they're not above using fear to get what they think the correct outcome is. Now, that does cause a problem. And what I think happens is then people think this is going to go away, right? They think that, so part of the trucker protest, let's say, is we just want things to return back to normal. That sounds nice, and I like that, and I would like that also. I'm thinking another step beyond that, which is, and it's unfortunate, I actually don't think we're ever going back to normal, regardless of if tomorrow everyone around the world declares the pandemic is over and all the regulations are done. I don't think people understand yet how much much people's, well, it's true. I mean, I'm all for that. I'd like to see an ease of all these restrictions and getting back to some sort of normality. I think no matter where you're at on the political spectrum, people genuinely probably want that. There may be a small percentage of people that have become
mentally ill.
Well, that's a harsh word, but yeah, I mean, to
look,
some
if
degree.
you're 2 years past and you want to keep putting on restrictions, I'm sorry. There has to be a point where we start saying there's a portion of the population that's unwell. I'd like to help them. I want them to get the help they need, but they can't hold the rest of the population hostage because they're still, living in high levels of neuroticism. That's a problem. It's a problem that must be dealt with. I mean, pandemic is a legitimate threat. It breaks people.
These things are coming.
Broken.
Look, I'm not like, it's hard for me. And I'm a person that has been fairly isolated. I didn't really have much of a problem with isolating myself because I pretty much live this way anyway. But when I go outside and I go to the beach, and like I said, I live in Florida. Last time I did that was a few weeks ago. I saw people by themselves walking outside with a mask on. And now it's starting to get like, I just don't know.
We got to start asking questions, buddy.
Like,
we got to start asking some questions. Like,
but
look,
if it's
you
the
can wear
case that
mask
they
for the
are
rest of
really,
your life, but like,
if they're really having a hard
rational.
time mentally, then we also need to, I guess, somehow ease that down. I don't think it's a good idea necessarily.
Who cares? All right, let the people wear the mask for the rest of their life to their sleep. I don't care about this. We're getting way off of the topic here. The point is to go back to what you were saying, which is also like off the point. Yeah. Okay. So what is it? The curtain in the Wizard of Oz. The curtain has been pulled back. Everybody that didn't even care about politics before is into politics now. And the people that did care about politics are fully radicalized. Okay. So, and no one trusts their government anymore. Beyond that, less people trust the institutions that used to be relatively normal. I didn't give a fuck about the CDC before. I never thought there was any, I never cared. I've always been a little iffy about the FDA. Now, the FDA, if you're a true leftist, or you were at some point like me, you've been on to the FDA for quite a while. Now, I am even more onto the FDA, so these things, I am radicalized more than I ever fucking would be or ever fucking wanted to be. And that's what happens, because this was so mishandled. Never mind that also a lot of division has been caused that probably accelerated things, probably accelerated a lot of cultural decline and strife that otherwise maybe would have come down the pipes eventually, but now it's just kind of like shot us into the future because it's an emergency situation. But here's the thing. Let's roll it back to the topic here, which is fear. Want to come back to this fear, right? So we've seen, you made the point that, well, perhaps it's benevolent intentions to use fear to get people to do something that you think is good for them. And we've spoken about that idea of trying to fool people into doing things that are good for them in the Ex Machina episode, and why that's flawed, unethical ultimately, because you're acting upon people without their consent, and you're trying to bypass their individual sovereignty. So I think that that's blatantly, just based on that alone, you can't do that. You have to let people, for the most part, experience the consequences of their own choices, because you don't know everything. Just this idea, like the fact that, get vaccinated, whatever, all of this has become open sloganeering is wrong, because that's a medical choice, and not everybody is going to react to that medical procedure in the same way. I mean, there are people that, yeah, you should absolutely get vaccinated. Great, do it. Put the little Instagram sticker on your profile, do it all. But there are people that genuinely shouldn't. I mean, and their doctors are the ones that will say that. So this messaging is like this blanket application of an idea that's already just based on the fact that people's bodies and, medical states are different, is flawed. It's unnecessary. It
But I
doesn't
think if
lacks
you,
the nuance that's necessary for that kind of, discussion.
there's a problem. The problem is that I think if you were to go look at the CDC website, they would actually say there are some people that have particular conditions or whatever. They'll say that somewhere on their website that should not do that. The problem is messaging and communication to some degree. Whenever you communicate to a huge audience, you don't communicate in nuance. That's partially just a problem with communicating to a large audience. Now, I don't think I was off point. We were talking about the general idea of people using fear to manipulate people. And that's why I was saying there are still people walking around outside with masks.
Yes.
And I'm not talking about walking around on a sidewalk getting ready to go into a building. They're jogging in the open air with no one
Dude,
around
I know.
them. So
I saw
so
people
that
hiking
is
in the mountains. I was
so
just
that
like,
is-
man. And that was yesterday.
so that is an example of fear, still
Yes.
with us.
Well, it's not even an example of fear, right? Because yes, on one part it is, but what struck me about like seeing people yesterday, in the mountains, in a fairly, it's not a crowd with a mask on, is just like, do they even actually know, the risks? Like when you're outdoors, all of this, like it's not even just like, oh wow, look at these people, they're so afraid. What it strikes me as, it's like, are they informed? Like, are they aware of, the drastically lowered risk of contracting this virus when you're on top of a mountain with only, yourself? So it also has this degree to which, like, are people even getting informed about these things? So I don't know where someone would be getting that information at this point, because I don't even think the CDC tells you to wear a mask outside on a mountain by yourself. That seems...
I don't think they do. And I could be wrong. Maybe we're misinforming people, but I'm pretty sure that quite a while back
I think
they
if you're on a
finally...
mountain, you're good. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, fear... Well, that's kind of what was definitely used throughout the pandemic also, which I thought was very... I thought was wrong, because people are already afraid. It's a virus and it has to do with your life. So people are afraid. And it makes me think back to past leaders, or the idea of like kind of like a stronger leader that doesn't lean into using fear to motivate and direct their population, but actually tries to unify and encourage people. Like there's another way to do that. Like there's absolutely another way to lead during stressful, unpredictable times, and it doesn't have to be through fear. Fear, on the contrary, like we spoke about in the Ex Machina episode, also has all these other negative side effects. Fear in and of itself is bad for your health. So if you have people that have been under severe, like this, worried that they're gonna die for 2 years straight, those people are already suffering negative health effects without even ever contracting the virus. So there's all these other outcomes that come from using a tool like fear to get what you want as a leader. But there's another element to this, right? So we talk about how the media uses fear in this movie, and I mean, do we even need to talk about that anymore? Like, do we even need to make this point? Is it not obvious?
I'll actually tell a personal anecdote briefly.
That's
Something
rare.
just occurred to me. I actually forgot it, which was, this all started back in like December 2019. I remember watching the news articles about China, there's a virus, and you'd see the little picture, like they're building hospitals. And I was like, okay, yeah, because I've been to China before. I was like, this could be bad. But, it's weird because in February, I had been accepted to an art exhibition. I went down. We knew that the idea was still in China, whatever. But I mean, if you kind of use your brain,
Yeah.
it's a virus, it's probably moving around. And I was a little bit wary, because I'm a little neurotic. Like I'm a little bit, I don't like getting sick. But I was like, okay. So I went to the gallery, put the painting there, and then I actually went and watched a movie with a friend. I remember I was feeling a little bit like stuffed up. I was like, I don't know, maybe I could have the virus. Do you want me to come over and hang out? And yeah, it's fine. It didn't. And now look, one way you could portray this is simply, the reality was there was no particular reason to be that afraid because it wasn't widespread at the time. So you were acting logically. Though later we found out, I'm not sure if that's actually accurate, but I didn't start being afraid until I started seeing those death counters on the news, which is, by the way, the last time I really watched CNN was during that time. And, they had the death counter up there and the case counter, and it was constant. Then things started, there was definitely a point in March where I was also afraid. I was like, fuck, man, like I got to alcohol off the groceries and stuff. I don't know what's going on. I remember, it's very interesting. It's almost history now. It's 2 years ago. I remember, I remember talking to you. I was like, I'm going to go to the grocery store. And I had like one latex glove. I don't know why it didn't even make sense. I had no masks, and I had one latex glove, but it didn't even make sense. I just put one latex glove on and went to the grocery store and like touching things and like putting it in with that. And then like I remember being there and hearing someone cough like on an aisle next to me or whatever, and being like, but there was a little bit of it was still not that serious. Like there was something about it that was just more weird at that point.
Yeah.
But it's
the difference between like being told how to be afraid and then like your organic fear, right? Like, because in the beginning I was ready to go, boy. I was literally like looking at the actual charts of shit. Like I was doing numbers. I was really like tracking this shit before anyone even was talking about it, really. I was ready to go. I had my parents, I was like, don't even go outside your house. Leave the groceries there untouched for like an hour outside. I was taking every possible precaution because we didn't know. So that's the thing. You adjust your behavior based on what you know or what you don't know. If you don't know a lot, you take more precautions because you don't know. But the interesting thing there is like how our organic fear, our organic choices about how to protect ourselves then changed when we were told what the right ways to protect ourselves were. And part of that makes sense, of course. Like, okay, now you know that like the glove doesn't really do anything at all, really, but the mask is better at, an airborne virus. But it's like, then things started to become politicized. And that was different. That's kind of where things changed. Because there was a moment at the beginning when things hadn't become politicized yet. And everybody was kind of like, as a human being, dealing with this developing reality. Once things started to once information started to come out enough and like things started to get politicized or whatever, then everything changed. Everything got different. And then the rest is history.
Well, it's a history we're going to live with for a while. And that's the thing about fear is people think that everything's going back to normal, and I hope that is true to some degree, but people remember. And I remember, and I'm not going to forget. And I'm never going to forget. I am never going to forget telling people, yeah, I think that it's very possible that this virus came from that virus laboratory, and people calling me Alex Jones. People I knew. I'll never forget it, and I will not forgive it entirely. So because I'm not a fascist or a Christian particularly. So I don't have that I just
You're literally quoting the protagonist like of the movie, like, I will not forget.
And look, it's fine. But it's fine.
I mean, the protagonist of the movie was right. You shouldn't forget.
Well, a brief note on that, and going back to our first episode, I'll keep this very brief. But something I thought was interesting is that so the bad people in this movie are the kind of the Christian fascists or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have the guy who I guess was a medical experiment. He ultimately sacrifices his life for the betterment of humanity, right? To some degree for vengeance. So in this sense, I'm not sure that my point holds. But he is a bit of a Jesus character. He's this person that sacrifices himself to bring down evil, right? he knows he's going to die. Remember, he goes willingly to
Mm-hmm.
his death at that end scene. So I just think it's kind of interesting to think about that in terms of this a very complicated psychological goings on in this film, because in some sense you have this one might say almost kind of true Christian figure or whatever in the film that is the V for Vendetta guy. Though I don't think that's exactly right either, because he does murder people and this and
Well,
that.
he's a little more hardcore than Jesus, like he's like, political Jesus. Like if Jesus was politically active, not just religious. If Jesus was an activist. If Jesus
It's
was
a minor
in
note.
Antifa.
Don't want to spend too much time on it.
Anyway, all right, enough of your minor notes. So look at it. Look at this here. Look at this note that I have. So we talk about the media. They're fucking things up. They tell you to be afraid of everything, whatever. Misinformation is going to kill you. There's a podcaster out there. He's going to end the world, because those are real fears that you should have. That's definitely what you should be worried about. Information and words, that's a luxurious fear to entertain, but they tell you to entertain it. What I think is interesting here is the degree to which people want these stories, the degree to which we are willing participants in being fed a particular world view. So what frustrates me about this movie and how it reflects upon our real world is that you see this attempt to kind of break people out of a certain system and way of being. So everybody in the film lives in fear, and there's kind of this isolation. Everybody is, they hang out in bars, they do things or whatever, but there's no candidness, there's no honesty. It's kind of like these pre-approved activities. Like, let's hang out in this bar and watch the show that is allowed to be watched. And as people start to get radicalized by the chaos being introduced into order, that is the political activist, that is V, pushing back against the regime through blowing shit up. And side note, this movie really does glorify a little terrorism. Kind of made me want to do a little of the big T, Those buildings blowing up. It's pretty. Gotta say, they got a point. Those terrorists, they got a point. I mean, the movie literally does say, like, a building is a symbol. To blow it up is to give people hope. And I was like, you know what? In some cases. Now, I don't advocate blowing up buildings. I don't. But I can entertain
I actually thought that
the
was
argument.
stupid. I thought that was a stupid idea. And I also think it was a stupid idea to blow up Parliament, because it's a nice building. If they were going to blow up buildings in the movie, it seems like they should have blown up ugly buildings. Fight Club does that better. So,
Yeah, Fight Club blows up the banking centers. It's that same dynamic, though. This idea that there's something creative in destruction and whatnot. But
this is where I actually...
Yeah, I know. There's a little bit of that kind of like nihilistic teen vibe, right?
It's not just that. It's the problem with this broader thing, which we've been talking about, which is populism, which is it really populism, or is it manipulation to some degree? Because there's two people manipulating groups. There's the good guy, which is the V, and then there's the bad people, which is the whatever they are. But he manipulates the population. He sends 800,000 or whatever it is masks out to the population. He conducts acts of political terror against spokespeople of the regime and murders them in order to foment rebellion. He packs the train full of explosives and then makes someone else pull the lever for it. That's the danger of populism, because are you really, if you're in the crowd putting on a mask, hiding your identity in order to make a political point, you've lost your individuality there also, and you're being manipulated. And so that's where I think that my take on it is more that there's maybe some sort of wisdom in the knowledge of common people that should be listened to and understood. But the danger of populism is someone's always at least trying to pull the strings.
Yeah, that's the problem, because populism still has the leader, right? Like there is still a leader of a populist movement, and so I agree to a certain degree that populism entails some manipulation, though of course those people did willingly show up. It's different when you're, compared to the authoritarian regime where they're forced to act in certain ways. There is, that's a super populist scene in the movie, like where you have the end and everybody actually doesn't have identities. They are just a mass of people. And that is...
They take the mask off at the end. And that's maybe the kind of throw to, oh, look, now you're an individual once you've created your political goal or something like that.
That's a good point. But at the end also they show like the faces of the people that died. So that's maybe those people were all dead. That you're confused about that scene. You thought that the artist was alive, like he's literally, they say he's dead. And then one of the girls was like one of the women that died in the testing experimentation camp, and her girlfriend was there, and the girl's parents were there. Like all those people were dead.
Well, we could debate that, but there's no indication. No, there's no indication any.
Where do you think they came from?
Hi, hello. Do you need to be deprogrammed? Think for a second. And also,
where
this is another thing.
Where do you think they came from?
Do you remember the fact that, and this is something I take umbrage with you about this film? You're like, the protagonist, Natalie Portman, becomes a free individual through she's tortured and lied to by the protagonist, V for Vendetta. He tortures her, and then she becomes free. No, she doesn't. She's tortured into then becoming a radical who blows up Parliament. In one way, you can read it that way. And now you're trying to tell me that because he said the artist was killed or whatever, that he definitely was, or because he said that this person, was dead.
Parents.
No, that is, huh?
Aren't her parents in the ending scene?
Not that I noticed. I only noticed the gay artist or whatever, who we do see carted away for sure, but they never show him being killed.
But there's also the lesbian, like the idyllic lesbian couple.
But do you remember that that's just a story by V?
But then why did they show up at the end? Because
they're not dead. Oh. Or you have to assume that the movie, which it doesn't do anywhere else, suddenly breaks the internal logic and reality of the movie to show people that are dead for some reason amongst the crowd. And fine, maybe that was an artistic flourish that I don't understand. I'm simply giving you the conspiracy theory that I have made up from watching this, and it's not really a conspiracy theory. Look at the facts. To some degree, V is a abomination of some sort of nature, right? Like, isn't he? Like, he has no eyes.
Yeah, he's like a mutant. Also, he's like not immune. He's like immune to fire. Whatever. The man walks through a fire and is like, I'm
whatever
okay.
It is. Yeah, probably in the comic book explains more. He tortures the only person that's kind of like he basically creates a terrorist.
Yeah.
He psychologically breaks down and tortures a person in order to then make them
for the greater good.
Okay, and then, in a sense, he's also a bit of the kind of suicide bomber type, in the sense that he does, you can look at things.
Literally shows up, with a bomb vest,
He does, doesn't he?
No, he's a terrorist, dude. I admit he's a terrorist. Like, I'm the first one to say that the guy was a terrorist. But here's the thing, right? Here's the thing. There's this another argument here, which is when you have a regime that is so, authoritarian, then that's what you get. You're going to get this kind of anarchic, rebellious figure, and you're gonna get a war. I don't know. Yeah, I thought they broke the logic of the film and showed like this magical scene at the end where it's like all these people actually they're amongst you, like that kind of thing. That's
yeah,
what
maybe
I thought.
That's what it was.
Either way, whatever. Let's move away from this. So what I thought though was interesting is this idea. So how much do people even really want to actually know the truth of things? Because as that investigative party member, like the guy that's like going around doing the investigations,
He's just a detective.
Oh, he's a detective. Okay. He starts to, look through everything and starts to notice a few little discrepancies, few coincidences, as they call them in the film. And at one point, he asks, when he's pretty certain something sketchy happened, he asks, would you really want to know? Would you really want to know if it's your government that's behind all these atrocities and all the suffering and all the harm and the problems that have gone on? Would you want to actually know if it all came back to the choice of a few people in power? And I think that has some parallels to this pandemic right now, because I definitely see that there's a lot of things that were exacerbated through the actions of people in power. Are you looking
You want me to just go ahead and say it? I'll say it blatantly. It's very possible that we started the pandemic because Fauci under the NIH and other people, Peter Daszak is another one, were running and supporting to some degree, even though they say it's not gain of function because they changed the definition and then said we're not doing it. It's very possible they had a hand, not purposely, I'm not suggesting purposely, for this story in the first place. So would you really want to know? If that were the case, and I think there's a lot of people that this is where a lot of people don't want to know. They just don't want to know. They'd rather not get into it.
I think that's a genuine thing. And that's kind of the question that this movie puts forth in a more subtle way. It's that it's not so much the problem with the authoritarian regime itself. It's the fact that many people might prefer to believe that the authoritarian regime is a necessary evil in their life. That it's actually not that this thing is responsible for all their suffering and then gave itself legitimacy through creating more suffering, which you see in the film, this idea that, we're going to make them afraid to show that they need us and whatever. There's also a few little elements going on in this film where some of the main figures in the party are tied to pharmaceutical industries or pharmaceutical companies that they were trying to find some kind of medication for the virus that they were experimenting on people with.
I don't like these questions. These are making me uncomfortable. I think your questions might be transphobic.
I think so too.
Because listen, it's a free vaccine. The vaccine's free.
Get 50.
Simultaneously free, but somehow also Pfizer has made, I think it's something like $30 billion or something this year. So that's interesting how something can be free. But we won't get into that. It is free.
No.
I understand that people can get it for free, but someone's paying for it. And
there is no free. That's the problem, with these ideas of free, is that there is no such thing as free. Someone paid for it somewhere, and it's actually fucking us also, because these things, the research and whatnot, is largely taxpayer funded for a lot of these, not just this, but other medications too. So, typical shit. We pay for the development and we pay for the product. Win-win. Anyway, so yeah, the question here is, would anybody want to know? And I think to a certain degree, people don't want to know how deep shit goes. Like, I don't think people want to think about how it's very likely that the pandemic wasn't an accident of nature. Let's put it that way. Not that kind of accident. That there's actually some genuine negligence and perhaps even some corruption involved in the 2 years of interruption and disruption to your life. I think that to a certain degree, people don't even want to grapple with the complexity of how much, this whole thing can be unraveled, like how many interests are involved, because I think it makes people feel powerless. And I think it's like it's much easier to say, you know what the problem is? Those people that won't wear a mask. Or, oh, this pandemic would be over if those people just got the vaccine. It's like, nobody. The gravy train ain't never going to stop unless someone stops it. Like, that's not, it's always easier to blame people closer to you. I think it makes sense. I think that's something that any person can fathom, which is these individuals are at fault. It's a lot harder to fathom that there's like a bunch of scientists collaborating on to make a virus more deadly, and then accidentally it gets out, and then accidentally it comes over here, and then oops, all these people have stocks in the same company that is going to create the cure, and then the cure is forced, and also you're having to pay for the development of the cure. Like, this goes to so many levels, and I don't know all of that. I don't even get into all of that because I just like kind of by de facto I'm like, yeah, no, it's probably corrupt. Like, you can just kind of maybe guess that it's corrupt when it gets that deep. So I don't think people want to know, because I think it's like people want to live their everyday lives also, like no one wants to spend, like, not everybody is Alex Jones. We can't spend like our everyday looking into the annals of government logs and whatever. And
Well, I like to do it.
yeah,
And I think there are
people that do.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of people that do like to do it, and there's going to be more of them that like to do it when the alternative, the kind of narrative like, don't look over this way, it's all good, it's probably just an animal or something that did it, even though they can't find that link and they haven't been able to, and it's 2 years in. I understand it becomes tiring. And it certainly becomes, maybe you have to have a certain mindset to not worry about looking into what may or may not be the case. I understand people want to live their lives, but my concern is that if some of the things that happened happen again, then we can't afford to just look away.
Oh, well, that's the problem. That goes back to the first episode we did on this movie, which is like you got to cultivate some anarchist tendencies so that you can keep your system of government in check. I think there's a danger to a population that becomes so complacent and so disinterested and changes their focus too far into the wrong subjects also. There's so much focus. Everything is about like, oh, this group or all these people that won't do the thing. Like, that's not important. Like, it's really not. Like, it doesn't matter if people get the thing or not. I don't like, I'm not gonna say vaccine now, like we just talked about the whole lab leak theory or something. Like, the vaccine is gonna be the one that gets us pulled. But I mean, this is gonna have to be a Patreon episode so people can actually watch it. But this is the thing. It's like, I think that what this movie does well is maybe remind people where corruption generally collects. And it's not in your neighbors' houses. It's not among the everyday people. That's not where you're going to find the genuine danger of corruption and the growth of tyranny. Now, perhaps the other side to that argument would be that when the everyday people become complacent and so focused on each other, that is what enables corruption and tyranny.
Well, and of course, your neighbor also could be a psychotic.
Well, that's unusual.
It's just they're probably not a mad scientist. So, there's that. Look, going back to the notes here and to sum up, I said, here's a possible antidote, or maybe you wrote that.
No, you did.
Did I? Great. That was genius. So my thing is kind of this, because it would be unfortunate that this becomes, even though it has to some degree in this scenario, a left-right dynamic, or a dynamic between this political party and that. And I think that the reason I've been a little bit more positive lately is because I've actually carefully watched this Canadian trucker convoy protest, and I very rarely would ever suggest things to people. But there's a YouTuber called Viva Fry who goes down there, and he actually just for hours at a time streams it. It's really something to check out, something to look at. But my whole thing is this: that beyond the politics, we have differences. We can argue those out. My whole thing is look at power centers, look at centers of power, regardless of how they're aligned, and be critical and skeptical. That's all. And that's good. That's great for everybody. It helps the power centers stay on the right track. And it keeps things, I think, ultimately free and safe and chugging along as best we can. And so that's my whole thing. This movie, V for Vendetta, was set in a fictional world in which the power had gone to the far right and was a problem. I don't know if we'll see many films in the future, probably not, where the power has gone to something along the far left, and then that's a problem. But I'm just saying, regardless of political intent or what people say or how they try to mask themselves and protecting you or being a good person or this or that, always be skeptical of power. That's all. I personally thought that was a liberal thing, and that's how I operated for most of my adult life. And I thought that's what I was supposed to do. And then the last couple of years now.
Until the left took power.
Right. And so now I'm, like not
politically
there anymore.
homeless. Yeah. Well, that's the thing with that is that, like we spoke about in the first part of this, in the episode on this movie, it's a different framework. It's like you can't look at things from this dynamic of the problem is the right. I'm sorry, if you're still on that, you're gone, man. You're out in the boondocks of analyzing the world, because the problem is not one political party per se. The problem is the kind of people that are drawn to power. And that's why, regardless of who's in power, they need to be scrutinized. And I think that the lack of scrutiny is a problem when it becomes something that, like, you don't want to scrutinize your own side, and you give too many allowances if it comes from the right people and whatnot, or fits the narrative that you have already adopted. Then that's a problem, because it kind of blinds people to being able to see these dynamics, to being able to see when people are using fear to stoke panic, and to get people to rush to make certain decisions, and to feel like there's an urgency and like everything is life or death, and you need to depend on us for your safety and for the protection of everything. Like, those patterns play out regardless of what party is in power. I mean, we need to really transcend that framework of viewing things in terms of parties and ideologies. It's just power versus those that don't have it, and the balance between those two sides. All right, that's it. That's all I have to say. I mean, you can just look at the world and analyze these same dynamics play out throughout history, throughout different cultures, all that. But if you would like some company as you analyze the world, feel free to join us over at the Silver Eye Society on Patreon. You can like this video and you can subscribe to this YouTube channel if you'd like to help us keep talking about things that we're not supposed to talk about as the peasant class, The peasants sure are getting loud these days. What a danger. It's the real danger.
Well, there's peasant channels now. Before, you needed a radio station. Now, all you have to do is buy a $50 microphone
The
and have
peasants
an
are
internet
empowered.
connection. So, peasant power.